So, today we're talking about Babylon, written and directed by Damien Chazelle. If you liked La La Land, you might be interested in this. It's the same filmmaker, obviously. It stars Margot Robbie, what an amazing cast. Brad Pitt, Gene Smart, Tobey Maguire, Max Minghella, Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Olivia Wilde, they're all in it. We are Boys on Film. My name is Phil. Thank you very much for being here. Do subscribe if you are new here. We talk about movies all the time. We talk about music as well. But here's Chris. Christopher is here.
Hello. Hi, Phil.
What a head this movie was. In more than one way, I think.
Okay, let's go straight in. Yeah, look, big film. You know, the word I keep thinking about every time I think about this film is just big. You know, we saw it in IMAX, so the screen was colossal, and I felt like a little flea watching it. You know, it was enormous. But it's like big budget. It's got big names in it. It's a big story, and you know, I love the fact it's a Hollywood film about Hollywood films. You know, I don't want to do too many spoilers about the plot, but you know, I really enjoyed that it's of the thing it's talks about. You know, it's the same thing. You know, it's a massive film about the history of film, or a part of the history of film, and you know, it's just big. You know, it's almost to the point of overwhelming. You know, I mean, it's a real kind of feast, audio, visual, as well. You know, there's a lot to take in, but actually, it's also very long. But what's really interesting is, I think, because of the richness of it, the length actually kind of works. I mean, neither of us are massive long film fans, but something about the space that this film had to inhabit because of its length meant that the kind of richness of it wasn't like, you know, massively overwhelming. It was kind of half overwhelming.
You can just imagine Damien Chazelle sitting down with a pen and paper and just writing down what he wants this movie to be, because you mentioned big. I mean, let's talk about the cast. That's a huge cast. It's a huge budget. I think it cost between $78 and $80 million, which is massive by anyone's standards, I think. It's a story about decadence and depravity, again, which is big. Lots of orgies going on. Lots of sex, lots of pooing, lots of puking. I mean, it's all there. It's vulgar. It's ridiculous. It's big. Big. And like you say, we saw it on the big screen. At one point, I laughed because somebody came into frame on the right-hand side, and I saw you do exactly the same as what I did, because as I did it, I turned my head to the side. You did the same. It's like, I've got to follow the screen. It's almost like the screen was just wrapped around us. It was crazy.
Things like, you know, there's a pile of cocaine, which, you know, if anyone's ever seen a pile of cocaine, it's quite a bizarre sight anyway. But this was like, you know, 20 feet tall on the screen in front of us. I mean, you know, the scale of everything is just like, you know, as you say, like the orgy scene, you know, the nudity is big. Everything is big. And, you know, the first kind of 20 minutes, half an hour, I actually ended up, I felt quite dizzy, because you're just on this kind of amazing journey of kind of decadence. And, you know, it's been a long time since I've been on a journey like that myself. And it was just dizzying, you know, but gets you into the film kind of in a really clever way. And, you know, it's pulling no punches. You know, it's not a Hollywood fairy tale version of Hollywood. It's a kind of warts and all, and saying that actually the depravity, the lack of integrity, the lack of professionalism, the sulks, the drama, the addiction was happening back in the mid-20s as well as it's happening now. It's not a new invention. It's been going on for 100 years, you know, and really enjoyed that, actually, because it just gave it this real kind of real grounding. I mean, I don't know anything about Hollywood films, but, you know, apart from watching them. But, you know, it just felt real. You know, it felt kind of big and real.
Brad Pitt stars as Jack Conrad, who's a popular silent film star, known for his very big flamboyant parties. We've got Margot Robbie, who I love. She stars as Nellie Leroy, who's an aspiring actress, and also the love interest of Manny, who is played by Diego Calva, who's a Mexican-American film assistant who wants to be bigger. Gene Smart, who I love. She was in a program recently, I can't remember what it was called, but it was a 2-series drama comedy about a stand-up comedian. What was it called? It's really bugging me. She's brilliant in this. Quite a small part for her, but she plays a journalist, a sensationalist journalist.
You're right. There's some great performances, you know, and, you know, if anybody knows about Hollywood actors know about Hollywood. So to get that kind of cast in to play what it is that they do anyway, is in a way it's a very obvious move, but very canny, because there's no question that Brad Pitt. I mean, I don't want to get sued here, but I'm sure Brad Pitt's been to a party or two, and I'm sure Margot Robbie has, seen some action in her time as well. These people, I think, had lived some of this. I believed that watching them. There was something very appealing for me about the fact that these actors were acting the history of how they got to where they are now, and how the industry that they're in got to where it is now. Great performances, and I mean, honestly, not a duff one. I thought everybody was playing where they should have been. Some people were more prominent than others, but great cast. Loved it.
Comparisons to La La Land, which you haven't seen, have you? You haven't seen that film?
I'm the only gay in the world who's never seen La La Land.
Give your gay card back. No, I loved it. I love La La Land. My other half wasn't so keen, but I was really emotionally engaged in that film, because without obviously telling the story of that film, it's not always rosy, but a lot of it is very kind of rose tinted, and you kind of get sucked into that dream world. And I was quite upset during La La Land. At the end, I was quite upset. It really affected me. But with this, I wasn't emotionally engaged at all. And I don't know whether that's something that I was meant to feel. I was meant to feel separate from their characters. Because, I mean, let's face it, a lot of these characters are just plain nasty, or they're really over the top. They're really kind of selfish, and they don't think of others, and they just want the career for themselves. They're, kind of thinking of the money all the time. And I guess that is what happens in the industry. So it's quite accurate in some ways. But for that reason, I didn't feel like I necessarily liked anyone or wanted to be on anyone's side, despite the performances, which I thought were terrific. I mean, Margot Robbie was just amazing in this, I thought.
Yeah, look, I can't disagree. I didn't feel a massive connection with them. There are moments, there's a really lovely scene with Brad Pitt where he goes to meet this gossip columnist, and, he has to hear some things that he doesn't want to hear. And actually, his reaction to that was very human, and, and very, we've all been in situations where we've been told things we don't want to hear. And, for people as delicate as some actors, that must be pretty difficult. And, I thought that scene was really kind of tender. But you're right, that there are kind of moments of those kind of human connection. But, most of the time, these people are pretty difficult to be around, and pretty difficult for us to be around. They were engaging, and I think another thing about the scale or the length of this film is that, there are several characters that we sort of follow their journeys through this kind of period of 5-10 years or something, and they're interweaving and they're kind of coming together, so they're not disparate stories. But there's enough space for us to follow each of those stories really well, I think, and there's some rising and there's some falling and there's some rising again and some more falling, and you go on this journey with all of them. And I think if it hadn't been whatever it was, 14 days long or whatever this film was, we wouldn't have had space to go on those journeys with everybody. But you do. It's interesting that you are a passenger in that journey. You're not experiencing it with them, but you do watch these journeys unfold that they go on, and it's engaging, even if it's not, kind of involving in that way.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing, because I think it definitely makes for a good movie. I mean, it's definitely entertaining. I mean, we touched on the time, which was, I think, 3 hours 9 minutes. I looked at my watch a couple of times, not because I was bored, but just because I was curious as to where it was going, because it does go off in different territories, and the story does take you somewhere else. I mean, at the end, it's the most bizarre thing. I mean, I'm not going to say what happens, but they go into this kind of club environment, which does take a dark turn, and you think to yourself, my God, this was the 20s. Was this really happening? Yeah. Of course it was, that kind of thing. But it almost goes really dark. And Tobey Maguire's character as well, he's a really dark, sinister character. I mean, so good. I mean, that, you don't really see that so much at the beginning. You see a lot of depravity and a lot of tension. But you also see, the sex at the beginning, the orgies and all that kind of drug taking and stuff. It's very wham bam. But we spoke about Baz Luhrmann as well, because a lot of those shots I think were very similar to what Baz Luhrmann does, particularly the orgy scene where you see the topless girls on their backs crowd surfing on top of the people, the crowds at the club. And I think a lot of those shots were reminiscent of what Baz Luhrmann does, and the style, very wham bam, which makes it more interesting.
The reason I made the Baz Luhrmann analogy afterwards with you is because there's depth to these scenes. When what it's like when you enter a club or you enter a bar or something. Your eyes do go from things that are right near you to things that are far away, and back and front and left and right. You're kind of you experience the kind of the dimensions, the spatiality of a space like that very much in the flesh. And a real trick in films is to sort of replicate that. And I think Baz Luhrmann does that very well with kind of layering shots, and things reveal themselves. And, sometimes it looks a bit vaudeville because you get kind of dancing girls kind of parting, and then behind them there's something else. And there's a bit of that kind of stuff that happens in this film too. But it literally draws you in because your eye goes in, because there's so much depth to look at. There's so much kind of richness, and not just because we saw this on the IMAX. In fact, I'd actually quite like to see it on a smaller screen next, because I suspect that effect is just as engaging. But a very, very rich film visually, some beautiful cinematography. I mean, absolutely stunning kind of lighting, really, really kind of crisp shots, and really sort of beautiful painterly images a lot of the time, which as a highly visual person, I really love watching a film that just looks like someone's painted it. And it was a joy to watch. Rich. I mean, it was like sitting down and eating, an entire packet of Angel Delight. I don't know if you do this very often. But I do.
God, that's gross. I used to hate that stuff. Was it butterscotch? My mum used to give that when I was a kid. Revolting.
It's not Angel Delight, though, because Phil doesn't like Angel Delight. It's like eating an entire bar of dairy milk. I don't know. It's like
Bouger, vegan chocolates.
Right, the vegan one. But, it's like it's rich, but not nauseatingly so. It's very clever how it doesn't, some films just tip me over the edge where I'm just like, okay, just too much, too rich, too much depth. This doesn't go that far. It's very clever, and I think it's quite measured, and it doesn't ever quite step off the cliff,
I think if you like the cinematography in this, which is gorgeous, I think you would like La La Land, because it's very similar. It's the same cinematographer, I think, and also the music is the same guy composed the score for this, which occasionally does remind you of La La Land, because it's got that kind of tinkly piano, very happy kind of incidental music that leads you into another scene, but it's not the same as La La Land, but you just get occasional references that remind you of that.
I'm going to give a little shout out for the music as well, actually, because I think you and I don't necessarily agree on this, but some Baz Luhrmann movies, the music, when it's kind of fiddled with too much, I find a little bit detracting. Because often he's using original music and layering it and kind of and doing stuff like that. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. What I think was really curious about Babylon is it's an original score. There's nothing, as far as I know, there's a couple of songs in it, but I think they're original songs. And most of the music is actually quite contemporary in terms of kind of beat and tempo and kind of the sort of drops and stuff like that, the kind of stuff that we're used to in modern music. But actually, it really plays those kind of those games that Baz Luhrmann does with it to really enhance and underpin the drama. So I really loved the music actually in this, and was thinking, I could play this stuff in the club, some of it. And then I was like,
I felt myself tapping my foot on the floor like repeatedly throughout this film, and I don't know what the person next to me on my left thought. She must have been quite irritated by that, but I was really going for it. I almost wanted to start dancing around the IMAX.
Well, see, I think that's a really clever thing, because I think we both really picked up on that. We both DJ in clubs. We both understand, what makes people dance. And I think there was an element of this in the soundtrack of this film. One thing that draws you into the film is we as contemporary viewers know what we like in Clubland today, but we can't possibly imagine what nightclubs were like in the 20s. And what's very clever about the soundtrack is it bridges those two worlds. It's got the thump and the immediacy and the breaks and the drops that modern clubbing does, but actually played, acoustically by bands. I think it's just a very clever. I mean, I'm making it sound really cheesy, but I actually think it's a really clever way to get your head into the decadence and the kind of clubby nature of the mid-1920s, which, of course, didn't have electronic music like we do now. Of course it didn't. But I was totally there with the soundtrack for that. It really supported my journey back to 1920s Clubland.
I don't know if this is a negative point, but do you think in some ways this film is more style over substance? Because we touched on, when we came out of the film, not wanting to talk about it too much here because it is a little bit of a spoiler maybe, but there's a kind of reference to how important cinema is at the end with a little bit of a montage. And I think that with a few other things where obviously the scenes change really quickly, and sometimes it does feel like, I don't know, there's lots going on, but just deliberately just to make things a bit controversial and a bit out OTT, and which is fine because that's, you know, it's meant to entertain. But I think sometimes it did feel like they were trying to prove a point and make it big cinema as well, because we spoke about that, how it does feel very big, and sometimes it feels a little bit deliberate. But I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. I can't quite work it out. I think it's a good thing because it's entertainment. When we came out, I was thinking to myself, is it like a performance piece rather than something I'm meant to emotionally engage with? Because I think the main problem that I had with it, and I didn't really have many problems with it because I enjoyed it, was, I mean, one of those was the length. I'm not a massive lover of like overly long films, but I think it was entertaining, so that wasn't necessarily an issue for me because it kept my interest. Like you said, it kept you engaged. Like I say, there's a lot of bodily functions, and which again I find quite amusing, because there's one scene, well, there's a puking scene, and I just wonder if the film is meant to be like that all the way through. It's meant to be pushing buttons. It just felt like the director was just trying to push buttons in all the ways that you could.
I know why you're saying that, but actually I don't think this was style over substance. I think it's a very stylish film. I think it's a very stylized film, you know. I mean, but that's the right thing to do when you're making a film about films of that nature. You know, the films that are being made during this film are highly stylized early Hollywood films. I mean, it's all about style over substance in those early films. There was very little substance. So it kind of was right to kind of play with that, I think. But I think it's just very stylish. And actually, the story, for me, is a fairly linear one. You know, it doesn't jump about too much. It's not too confusing. It's a relatively straightforward storyline. I don't think it's an overly simple storyline. I just think it's it's got 3 hours gives it enough time just to kind of happen like it should. So I think that I can see why people will be tempted to say there's way more style than there is story, but actually the story is there. It's happening logically, you know, in a nice linear way all the way through. It just has a lot of stuff going on, you know, visually and sound-wise around that. But for me, that's the right, as I say, the right approach to making a film about films of that nature. It's rich, you know, like those films were. I am going to give this 4 stars out of 5. The reason it doesn't get a 5 is because the end was slightly arduous for me. There were various moments where, you know, I was thinking, okay, that's the end, and it wasn't, you know, and I don't mind that, you know, but it just went on a little bit too long at the end. Weirdly, not really before that for me. And, you know, I think, you know, it wasn't a perfect film, but I thought it was a really well-made film. I thought it was a really entertaining film, and it's a film about film isn't always an easy thing to do. But I think getting this cast, getting the people that made this film together, throwing money at it, was the right thing to do. You know, I think it's the right answer. You know, if it had been me, I might have made it slightly differently and we'd have got a 5. But, you know, I didn't make it and someone else did, and they're going to get a 4.
Well, I'm going to go for a very strong 3. It's like I said to you when I came out, I didn't love it, but I did like it. I enjoyed it. And I didn't like it as much as La La Land. It's a very different film in some ways to La La Land. But I'm not saying that that's, you know, the 5-star movie. I would probably have given that 4 stars. But yeah, I liked this one less, so I'm going to give it 3. But it is a very strong 3. It's almost a 4, but not quite.
Yeah. No, I think that formally this film's got quite a nice structure, actually. It starts with this depravity, it ends with depravity, it's got rises and falls through it.
We love depravity.
We love depravity. And, you know, and of course, the thing about depravity isn't, you know, it people search for more, like we've talked about horror quite a lot in these chats, and, you know, the future of horror, it was just going to get worse and worse and worse, you know, and there's something about the depravity in this film where it get, you know, what you were just touching on there about the sort of last sequence. When you've seen the depravity at the beginning, you're like, oh, that's pretty extreme, you know, and it kind of keeps coming up with bodily functions all the way through. And then you get to this the last sort of half an hour or whatever it is of the film, where there's this new depravity that's happening. And actually, Tobey Maguire's character's like, well, we're having to do this because LA's become really boring. Everyone's just really bored of all the parties. Everyone's really bored of all the drugs and sex. We have to go to the next level. And he takes us down to this next level. And, I think that was really clever, because if it had just been another party like the party was at the beginning, I'd have been like, yeah, whatever, Toby, you don't mean it. But he took us to a whole new place. And
he's brilliant. But the main issue for me, like I say, was that I wasn't emotionally engaged. But I did question afterwards on my way home quite a bit, I was wondering if I was meant to, and maybe if I wasn't, then I probably would have given it a bigger score. But I'm comparing it too much to La La Land.
I think for me, it wasn't. I don't think it set out to be a peek behind the curtains to find the people who are the actors. I think what it was trying to present to us was the actors. It wasn't trying to show us the people and all their personalities and their foibles behind them. I mean, we get to see quite a lot of that. But you know what I mean? We didn't have to get to know them for that. I think it wasn't meant to be about that. I think it was meant to be about the characters as actors, not the characters as people, as actors. Sorry to be kind of finicky.
No, that makes perfect sense. I'm going to stick with 3. Maybe if I watch it a second time, we'll come back and revisit and give it a 4-star for me. You giving it a 4 stars, that's fine.
We should watch it all on very, very small screens. We watched it on the biggest screen in the whole of the world. And we should watch it on the smallest screen we could possibly find next.
Yeah. So it's released UK cinemas on the 20th of January, Friday 20th. We're a bit up front because we saw a preview screening. But I have to say also, we were treated to some rather nice popcorn, which made me feel a bit sick afterwards, I have to say, because it was so hot in there. It was really hot in this screening. And also we had some beer and we had fizzy and water. That was great. Thank you, Chris, as always. Maybe we'll do a horror next. Maybe this was partly horror, this movie. I mean, there's certainly some dark moments. If you're going to see it, by the way, do let us know what you think of it down below. Check out all the info, and also check out a playlist which is on the screen now, should be. And I'll see you next time, Chris.
Thanks very much, Phil. See you soon.